Okay, so I need you to stay with me for a second because what I'm about to tell you sounds like I'm making it up. And I promise, I'm not. 12,000 years ago, someone built a temple. Not a hut, not a pile of rocks, a temple. With massive carved stone pillars, some of them 6 meters tall, weighing 10 to 20 tons each, decorated with animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, wild boar, arranged in circles, built with intention, built with meaning. But here's where it gets weird. Here's the part that broke my brain when I first read it. Farming hadn't been invented yet. Writing? No. Metal tools? No. Cities? No. The wheel? Absolutely not. Everything we normally call civilization, none of it existed. The people who built this place were hunter-gatherers. They didn't even have pottery. And then, and I cannot stress this enough, after they built it, someone deliberately buried it, covered it in dirt, on purpose, like they wanted the whole thing to disappear. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it has quietly rewritten everything we thought we knew about human history. Let's get into it. So first things first, where is Göbekli Tepe? It's in southeastern Turkey, near a city called Şanlıurfa. The region is called the Fertile Crescent, which, if you've done any world history, you know is basically the birthplace of agriculture. The Tigris and Euphrates are close by. This whole area has been called the cradle of civilization for decades. But Göbekli Tepe itself? It sits on top of a ridge, a hill, and for most of the 20th century, local farmers had been working around these weird limestone slabs poking out of the ground and just assumed they were old grave markers or something. Nobody thought much of it. A Turkish survey noted the site back in 1963. Researchers from the University of Chicago visited in the 1960s and decided it probably wasn't interesting. They moved on. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt showed up. And unlike everyone before him, Schmidt looked at those stones and thought, wait, something is very wrong here. Very wrong in a very exciting way. He started digging, and what he found changed archaeology forever. But then, and this is the thing about discovery, the first thing you find is never the most surprising thing. You keep digging, and it keeps getting stranger. Okay, so imagine you're Klaus Schmidt. You're an archaeologist. You've trained your whole career to understand ancient sites. You have a framework, a mental map, of how human history works. Civilization develops slowly. First you get farming, then you get food surplus, then you get people settling down, then you get social hierarchy, then you get religion and monumental architecture. That's the sequence. That's the story. Now imagine that framework getting completely demolished by a pile of rocks in Turkey. What Schmidt uncovered at Göbekli Tepe were massive circular enclosures, each one built around pairs of T-shaped limestone pillars. The T-shape is thought to represent stylized human figures, arms at the sides, heads at the top of the T. The biggest pillars weigh about 20 tons. They stand 6 meters tall. There are hundreds of them, and they are covered in carvings. Incredibly detailed carvings. Foxes and snakes and cranes and wildcats and scorpions and vultures, all rendered with skill and precision. This wasn't crude scratching. This was art. Intentional, sophisticated, symbolic art. The site covers about 300 meters across. There are at least 20 enclosures, though most of them are still buried. Only about 5% of the site has been excavated. 5%. We've barely scratched the surface. Literally. Schmidt worked there every year until he died in 2014. He called it the first temple, the cathedral on the hill. He believed the whole site was a place of ritual, that hunter-gatherer groups came from hundreds of kilometers around to gather there, to worship, to conduct ceremonies, to bury their dead. But then the dating came back, and everyone had to sit down. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe have been dated to around 9,600 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago. To put that in perspective, Stonehenge was built around 3000 BCE. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza were built around 2500 BCE. The oldest known cities in Mesopotamia date to about 4000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe is older than all of them, by thousands of years. It predates the invention of writing by 6,000 years. It predates pottery. It predates the wheel. This should not exist, and yet here it is. Now here's where I want to take a little detour, because I think it matters for understanding why this place is so wild. When we think about hunter-gatherers, and I'm talking pre-agricultural Stone Age humans, we tend to imagine them as primitive, surviving, struggling, too busy chasing mammoth and foraging berries to have any time for philosophy or religion or architecture. That's not quite right, and Göbekli Tepe proves it spectacularly. Hunter-gatherers had brains exactly like yours and mine. They had language, they had stories, they had social bonds and rituals and beliefs. What they didn't have was the same scale of organization that agriculture later enabled. Therefore, the question that Göbekli Tepe forces us to ask is, what made 10-ton stone pillar construction possible without agriculture? Without farming, how do you feed thousands of workers? How do you coordinate hundreds of people over decades without writing or formal government? And the answer that archaeologists have landed on is religion, or rather, shared belief, ritual, the pull of something sacred. Schmidt himself was famous for flipping the conventional model on its head. For decades the story was, farming created surplus, surplus created settlement, settlement created social complexity, social complexity created religion and temples. That's the order. Farming first, temples later. But then, Göbekli Tepe shows up and says, actually, maybe temples came first. Maybe it was the shared purpose of building something sacred that motivated people to come together, to cooperate, to develop the agricultural techniques needed to feed that cooperation. Maybe religion didn't come from civilization. Maybe civilization came from religion. I genuinely think that's one of the most profound ideas to come out of archaeology in the last 50 years. And most people have never heard of it. Let's talk about the carvings because I think they're underrated. The animals at Göbekli Tepe aren't random. They appear in patterns. Certain animals cluster together. Certain enclosures seem to have themes. One might be dominated by snakes, another by vultures, another by foxes. This wasn't decoration. This was language. A symbolic vocabulary we haven't fully cracked. Vultures appear frequently. And in many ancient cultures, including later ones from this region, vultures were associated with death and with the passage of the soul. There's a practice called sky burial or excarnation, where the dead are left exposed to be consumed by birds. Some researchers believe that Göbekli Tepe may have been a place of death rituals, where the dead were brought, where bones were processed, where the community made sense of mortality together. Scorpions appear, snakes, foxes, which in later Mesopotamian mythology are associated with trickery and the underworld. Whether those symbolic associations stretched back 12,000 years, we genuinely don't know. But the possibility is there. There's also what researchers call the vulture stone, a large pillar with a carved vulture holding what appears to be a headless human or a sphere. Some interpret this as depicting a soul being carried to the afterlife. Some think it records an astronomical event, possibly a comet impact around 10,900 BCE, an event that plunged the Earth into a mini ice age called the Younger Dryas. That second interpretation is genuinely controversial. But the fact that it's even a serious academic hypothesis tells you how strange and rich this site is. And then there are the humanoid figures. Arms carved on the sides of the T-shaped pillars. Hands. Belt-like carvings around the waist. These pillars might not just represent humans. They might represent specific individuals, ancestors, gods. entities that the community was meant to commune with?
We don't know. That's the honest answer.
We don't know. And there's something beautiful about that. That there's a place on Earth this old, this deliberate, this full of meaning, and we can't quite read what it says. Okay, I've been building to this, because the weirdest thing about Göbekli Tepe is not that it was built. It's what happened next. Around 8000 BCE, give or take, the site was deliberately buried. Not collapsed, not abandoned, buried. Someone, a community, a culture, people who clearly knew what this place was, filled it in. They brought in tons of soil and rubble and covered the enclosures, one by one, until the whole thing was underground. And then they walked away. For 12,000 years it sat there, under a hill, until Klaus Schmidt started digging. Now, why would you do that? Why would you bury something so massive, so deliberately constructed, so clearly sacred? Archaeologists have a few theories, and none of them fully satisfy me, which is why I think this is the most compelling mystery of the whole site. Theory 1. Ritual closure. In some ancient traditions, sacred spaces were periodically ritually closed, buried or sealed to mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. Building a new enclosure on top of an old one, or burying the old one, was a way of completing a sacred cycle. Therefore, the burial was intentional in a spiritual sense, a sacred ending, not a destruction. Theory 2. The site was outgrown. The world was changing. Agriculture was beginning. Communities were settling. The nomadic hunter-gatherer culture that had built and used Göbekli Tepe was transforming into something else. Maybe the burial was a farewell. We are moving on, and we are putting you to rest. Theory 3, and this is the one that's darkest and most interesting: erasure. Someone wanted it gone. Whether that means it had become dangerous, religiously, politically, symbolically, or whether there was some kind of conflict, some shift in power or belief that made this place threatening. Someone decided, this needs to not exist anymore. We don't know which theory is right. We might never know. But the fact that the burial was so complete, so total, that it preserved the site almost perfectly and hid it from every subsequent human civilization until the 1990s. That's not nothing. That is a choice that echoes 12,000 years forward in time. Someone tried to erase this place, and instead, accidentally, they preserved it. Like the best stories, the attempt at destruction became the reason it survived. Let's talk about what this means, for real, for the actual story of who we are. For most of modern history, and I'm talking about the history of how we understand history, there's been a bias, a deep, quiet, structural bias toward writing, toward cities, toward empires, toward the kinds of things that leave records. Civilization, in the popular imagination, starts with Mesopotamia, with Sumer, with Egypt, with those first cities and their cuneiform tablets, and their gods and their laws. Everything before that is prehistoric, literally, before history, before it counts. But Göbekli Tepe says, that is a very limited definition of human greatness. Because here were people, no writing, no cities, no farming, who moved 20-ton stones, who coordinated over decades, who built something so sophisticated and so meaningful that they could justify the labor of hundreds, maybe thousands, of people coming together in one place. Not to survive, not to farm, not to build houses, to worship, to mark the sacred, to communicate something to the cosmos, or to each other, or to whatever they believed was watching. That's not primitive. That's not pre-civilization. That is civilization. It just doesn't look like what we expected. Therefore, what Göbekli Tepe asks us to do is reconsider the timeline, reconsider the definition. When we say a society is civilized, what do we mean? If it means organized, purposeful, symbolic, spiritual, socially cooperative, then hunter-gatherers were civilized 12,000 years ago, or more, and probably long before that. Which means the dark period before agriculture wasn't actually dark. We just couldn't see it. We didn't look. We assumed there was nothing to find. And this is personally the part that moves me most, because it means our history is so much longer and richer and stranger than we thought. There were people alive 12,000 years ago, standing on that ridge in Turkey, looking at what they'd built together, feeling pride, or awe, or gratitude, or reverence. Human feelings, recognizable feelings. And we are only now, 12 millennia later, beginning to understand what they made. Okay, so here's the situation on the ground right now. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe continue. After Schmidt's death in 2014, the work carried on under a new lead archaeologist, and it's still ongoing. The Turkish government has actually turned the site into a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It received that status in 2018. There's a proper viewing platform now, a roof to protect some of the excavated areas, visitor infrastructure. But remember, only about 5% has been excavated. The ground-penetrating radar scans suggest there are at least 16 more enclosures still buried, possibly more. Who knows what's down there? Who knows what carvings are still covered in 12,000 years of dirt? And there are still massive debates among researchers. Was this strictly a ritual site, meaning no one lived there? Or was there habitation too? The absence of clear domestic remains initially suggested it was purely ceremonial. But then bones and grinding stones were found, signs that people ate there, processed grain there. Maybe it was both. Was there a specific group, a priestly class, specialists, who maintained the site? Or was it a communal project, rotating groups of different hunter-gatherer bands coming and going across the seasons? And the big one, how far did the network extend? Some of the flint tools found at the site came from sources hundreds of kilometers away. People were traveling enormous distances to be there. Which means Göbekli Tepe wasn't a local thing. It was regional. Maybe more than regional. A kind of ancient pilgrimage destination. The idea of pilgrimage, of people leaving their home territory, journeying to a sacred place, participating in ritual, and returning, is typically associated with much later, more developed civilizations. But then Göbekli Tepe suggests this impulse, this need to travel toward the sacred, was already there, already fully formed, already part of what it meant to be human. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention the elephant in the room, which is that Göbekli Tepe has attracted a significant amount of, let's call it enthusiastic alternative theorizing. Atlantis, lost civilizations, ancient aliens. Göbekli Tepe gets pulled into all of it. And look, I get it. I genuinely get it. Because the site is so old, so sophisticated, and so mysterious that the imagination reaches for bigger explanations. If hunter-gatherers could build this, maybe there was a previous civilization we've forgotten about? Maybe this is the memory of Atlantis. Maybe something from the sky gave them the knowledge. But here's the thing. The reason Göbekli Tepe is wild is not that it requires an impossible explanation. It's that the actual explanation, actual human beings with actual flint tools and actual ropes and actual cooperative social organization, building something this extraordinary, is more radical and more moving than any lost civilization theory. The ancient alien theory, if you think about it, is almost insulting to our ancestors. It says, these people couldn't have done this alone. They needed help from outside. But then you look at what they built and you realize they didn't. They absolutely could. They did. And they did it without the wheel, without metal, without writing, without any of the things we think are required for greatness. The actual story is more humbling and more inspiring than the alternative. We have always been this creative, this driven, this spiritual, this human. I want to end on something a bit more personal, if that's okay. There's a specific feeling you get when you learn about Göbekli Tepe for the first time. I felt it. You might feel it too. It's a kind of vertigo, a sudden reshuffling of your internal map of time. Because we walk around with a story about the past that feels complete. Cavemen, then farming, then Egypt, then Greece, then Rome, then the Middle Ages, then us. It's a sequence, and it feels finished, like it's been written. But then, Göbekli Tepe reaches back 12,000 years and tugs at the edge of that story and says, there's more. There's so much more. And most of it is still underground. Schmidt said something that I think about a lot. He said that every archaeologist hopes to find something important. But this is something different. This changes the whole picture. He worked that site for 20 years. He died before most of it was excavated. He knew he'd found something that would outlast him by centuries. There's something beautiful and a little heartbreaking about that. A man who found the oldest temple on earth, who spent his life understanding it, who died before understanding it fully. The site will outlast all of us. The questions will outlast all of us. And that's fine. That's okay. That's what it means to make a discovery that's bigger than you. We tend to think of history as something that's over, fixed, written. But Göbekli Tepe is a reminder that it's still happening, still being uncovered. There are things buried in the earth right now that, when we find them, will change everything we think we know. Again. And maybe that's the real lesson of this place. Not just what it tells us about who our ancestors were, but what it tells us about the nature of knowledge itself. That it's provisional, that it's humble, that the best thing you can do, the most scientific, the most honest, the most intellectually alive thing you can do, is stay open to the idea that you might be wrong, that the next shovel strike might change everything. So, Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years old, built before farming, before writing, before cities, before everything we call civilization, except, apparently, the part of civilization that matters most. The need to build something sacred, the need to gather, the need to carve meaning into stone and say, we were here, we believed in something, we made this together, and then someone buried it, and kept the secret for 12,000 years, until one German archaeologist showed up with a shovel and refused to move on. I love this place. I love what it means. I love that it exists. And I think about it more than is probably healthy for someone who's never been to southeastern Turkey. If you found this as interesting as I do, subscribe, because I'm planning a whole series on ancient mysteries that archaeology actually has evidence for. Real stuff. Properly weird stuff. The kind that doesn't need ancient aliens to be mind-blowing. And if you've ever been to Göbekli Tepe, or if you know something about this I got wrong, tell me in the comments. Genuinely, I want to know. See you in the next one.